Picture this, a warm June evening in 1960, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air was crisp, carrying the fresh scent of pine from the thick Finnish forests surrounding Lake Bodom. It was the kind of evening that promised adventure, a night where the world seemed endless for four teenagers seeking nothing more than a little escape. Meillä Ermli Björklund, Anja Tulicki-Mäki, Seppo Antero Boisman, and Nils Gustafsson were just like any other teenagers, young, carefree, and eager to carve out their own piece of independence. They had planned this trip for weeks. Just four friends, a tent, a few bottles of soda, and the excitement of spending a night under the stars. As they set up their campsite by the water's edge, laughter echoed across the lake. The boys worked together to pitch the tent, hammering stakes into the soil, while the girls unpacked their small belongings, blankets, snacks, and a transistor radio. It was supposed to be a perfect night, but what they didn't know was that someone or something was already watching, and by morning, only one of them would be left alive. As the moon rose, the four teenagers settled in, basking in the glow of their newfound freedom. They stretched out on the soft grass, gazing at the clear night sky dotted with stars. Music crackled from their Radio American rock and roll tunes that had recently made their way to Finland. Seppo, ever the joker, tossed small pebbles into the water, watching the ripples spread out in the moonlight. Meillä and Anja whispered and giggled about a crush one of them had back in town, and Nils, with a grin, challenged Seppo to a playful wrestling match, which ended with both of them tumbling over in laughter. Everything seemed peaceful, but somewhere just beyond the tree line, a shadow lingered, a presence that the teenagers couldn't see. Was it an animal, a passerby, or something far more sinister? Witnesses later claimed to have seen the campers that night, their silhouettes faintly illuminated by their lantern. Everything had seemed normal until it wasn't. The trees stood still, the lake silent, a perfect calm, a calm that often comes before a storm. Between the dead of night and the earliest hints of dawn, between 4 and 6 in the morning, the nightmare unfolded. Inside the tent, the four friends were fast asleep, their breath slow and steady. The fabric of the tent shifted slightly with the breeze, but then a noise, a rustle, a presence closing in. Without warning, the tent was violently slashed open. A blade ripped through the fabric, sending shreds flying. The attack was swift, brutal, merciless. The teens never had a chance to react. Seppo and Anja were struck first, their bodies collapsing under the force of the blows. Meillä, still groggy from sleep, barely had time to scream before she was attacked with a savage fury, stabbed multiple times more than the others, as if the killer had directed a special rage toward her. Nils, the only survivor, would later say that he remembered nothing, only brief flashes, a blur of motion, a dark figure, and most hauntingly, a pair of glowing red eyes. Could this have been a hallucination, the mind's way of coping with trauma, or had he really seen something inhuman? By the time the sun rose over Lake Bodom, 3 teenagers lay dead, and Nils Gustafsson, bloodied and broken, was the only one left breathing. But the real question is, why was he the only one spared? The campsite that had been filled with laughter and warmth just hours before was now a blood-soaked horror. The once intact tent had collapsed in on itself, torn open like a gutted animal. The fabric, shredded and stained dark with blood, flapped slightly in the morning breeze. Inside lay the bodies of Meillä Ermli Björklund, Anja Tulicki-Mäki, and Seppo Antero Boisman, their lifeless forms twisted in unnatural positions. The brutality was staggering. Stab wounds covered their bodies, deep gashes marking where a knife had cut with relentless force. But one thing stood out: Meillä had been attacked far more viciously than the others. She had suffered more stab wounds, her injuries more severe, almost as if the killer had personal hatred for her. The act of overkill suggested deep, uncontrollable rage. Why? Had the murderer known her, or had she simply been the target of some twisted fixation? As authorities later pieced together the scene, one detail remained chillingly clear. The killer hadn't used a gun or a single lethal strike. This was a crime of passion, one fueled by raw, unfiltered violence. Amidst the carnage, amidst the blood and broken bodies, one person remained alive: Nils Gustafsson. He was found outside the tent, sprawled on the cold ground, barely clinging to consciousness. His injuries were severe, his jaw shattered, his face swollen and bruised beyond recognition. His body bore deep cuts, but strangely, they weren't as extensive as those suffered by his friends. When he was finally pulled to safety, he barely spoke. He seemed disoriented, trapped in the fog of trauma and pain. When investigators pressed him for details, he could recall nothing but fleeting images: shadows moving, fabric tearing, pain exploding across his skull. And then something strange. When asked if he saw the attacker, Nils hesitated. His breathing grew shallow, and in a voice barely above a whisper, he uttered something that would haunt investigators for decades. Red eyes, bright red eyes watching me. Had he imagined it, or had something beyond human comprehension lurked in the darkness that night? One thing was certain: he was the only one left alive. But why? Had the killer spared him? Had he been knocked unconscious before he could be finished off? Or was there another possibility? Had he known the killer? As dawn broke over Lake Bodom, the first eyewitnesses unknowingly stepped into history. A group of young birdwatchers out enjoying the crisp morning air noticed something unusual: a blonde-haired man walking away from the tent site. He moved with a strange, hurried pace, almost as if he didn't want to be seen. At the time, they thought little of it. A camper, perhaps, or a fisherman heading home. They didn't know that behind them, in the shadows of the forest, 3 teenagers lay dead. Hours later, a carpenter named Esko Oiva Johansson was walking near the campsite when something stopped him in his tracks. The tent collapsed, blood everywhere, and then the bodies. Panic gripped him as he stumbled back. The eerie stillness of the scene, the unnatural silence, made his skin crawl. He ran, breathless, until he could find someone to call the police. But by the time authorities arrived, the damage had already been done. The crime scene had been exposed to the elements for hours. Rain had begun to fall, washing away potential evidence. Curious locals had already approached the area, unknowingly trampling the ground, contaminating the only clues that could have led to the killer. The investigation was about to take a series of disastrous turns, mistakes that would haunt this case forever. From the moment authorities arrived at the scene, mistakes were made, mistakes that would haunt this case for decades. Instead of securing the crime scene, officers allowed locals, bystanders, and even reporters to wander freely around the area. The ground near the tent, where the killer might have left footprints, was trampled beyond recognition. Any fingerprints, blood trails, or discarded items that could have held clues were either moved, stepped on, or completely ruined. The tent itself, a crucial piece of evidence, was mishandled. Investigators folded it up and took it away before it could be properly examined, potentially destroying fingerprints or fibers left behind by the killer. Even the bodies were moved before proper forensic documentation. Perhaps the most devastating error. In 1960, DNA analysis didn't exist and forensic science was still in its early stages. But instead of preserving what little evidence they had, authorities failed to collect samples that could have been reanalyzed decades later when technology had improved. A brutal triple homicide, a shattered crime scene, And now, with so much contaminated evidence, investigators were left with little to go on. Had they just let the killer slip through their fingers? As detectives tried to piece together the events of that night, one detail stood out: the killer had taken things. The victims' wallets and motorcycle keys were missing. Yet, strangely, the motorcycles themselves remained untouched. Why steal the keys but leave the bikes? Even more unsettling, Nils Gustafsson's shoes were found neatly placed over 500 meters away from the crime scene. How did they get there? Did the killer take them? Was it some kind of twisted trophy? Or had they been moved after the attack, possibly by Gustafsson himself? The placement of the shoes raised an eerie question. If Nils had been inside the tent when the attack happened and he had been too injured to move, how did his shoes end up so far away? Had he wandered there in a daze before collapsing? Or was there another possibility? Had he been outside the tent when the killings occurred? The missing evidence wasn't just bizarre, it suggested that whoever committed this crime wasn't just acting on impulse. There was something deliberate about it, something that didn't quite add up. With few leads and no clear suspect, the police turned their attention to a strange local figure, Karl Gyllström. Gyllström was the owner of a small kiosk near Lake Bodom, selling food, drinks, and camping supplies. But to those who knew him, he was far from friendly. He was short-tempered, aggressive, and had a deep-seated hatred for campers. On multiple occasions, he had been seen throwing rocks at tents, cutting guy lines, and even threatening visitors with violence. Could this have escalated into murder? Locals whispered that after a few drinks, Gyllström would openly brag about killing the teenagers. Some even claimed he had described details about the crime that had never been made public. But there was a problem. Despite these eerie confessions, no hard evidence linked him to the crime. And in 1969, Gyllström drowned himself in Lake Bodom. Suicide or something else? Had guilt finally caught up with him? Or had someone silenced him? With Gyllström dead, the truth, if he had truly been the killer, was buried with him. A dead suspect, a missing murder weapon, and a case that refused to close. Was this another dead end? Or was the real killer still out there, hiding in plain sight? Of all the potential suspects in the Lake Bodom murders, one stood out for his disturbing timing and behavior: a former German soldier named Hans Assmann. His connection to the case was pure coincidence, or was it? The day after the brutal slayings, Assmann showed up at a Helsinki hospital with blood on his hands and his clothes in disarray. He seemed nervous, agitated, his eyes darting around as if he expected to be followed. Doctors were immediately suspicious. His injuries were minor, small cuts and bruises, nothing life-threatening. But when they asked him what had happened, he refused to answer. He just sat there, shifting uncomfortably in his chair, as if weighing his words carefully. But the real red flag: his clothes had been soaked in blood. And yet, despite the obvious connection, a strange man appearing bloodied at a hospital less than a day after a triple homicide, police dismissed him almost immediately. His alibi, convenient yet inconsistent. At the time, investigators claimed they had checked his whereabouts and found that he couldn't have been at the murder site. But decades later, doubts about this so-called ironclad alibi began to surface. Some theorists suggest Assmann may have been involved in secret operations, possibly connected to intelligence services, which could have led the police to quietly sweep his involvement under the rug. Others believe he may have had ties to someone high up in law enforcement, which could explain why he was never formally investigated. Was this just an unfortunate coincidence, or had police let the real murderer walk away? One thing was certain: his name would never truly disappear from discussions about the case. Years later, A new suspect emerged not through an investigation, but through a shocking jailhouse confession. His name was Pentti Soinanen, and he was already behind bars for other violent crimes. While serving his sentence, he allegedly told fellow inmates that he had committed the Lake Bodom murders. At first, authorities were intrigued. Could it be that after so many years, the mystery was finally solved? But there was a problem. Soinanen had been only 14 years old in 1960. Even though he had a violent history, people doubted whether a boy of his age could have overpowered and killed 3 people in such a brutal manner. There was also no physical evidence linking him to the crime. So why did he confess? Was he seeking attention, trying to intimidate other prisoners, or more chillingly, was he involved but not acting alone? Had he been a lookout for someone older? Had he participated in the crime but let another person deliver the fatal blows? Unfortunately, the truth about Soinanen's confession died with him. He took his own life before investigators could interrogate him further. Was this just another false lead, or had authorities let another chance for justice slip through their fingers? Decades passed, leads dried up, witnesses faded into memory. The families of the victims never got closure. Investigators came and went, each hoping to be the one to solve the case, only to find themselves trapped in the same endless maze of dead ends and contradictions. Without DNA evidence, without a murder weapon, and with the crime scene hopelessly contaminated, the police had no concrete way to identify the killer. It became one of Finland's most chilling cold cases, a mystery that refused to die, whispered about in true crime discussions, and passed down like an urban legend. But was the case truly cold? Because years later, in the early 2000s, investigators made a shocking decision, one that reignited the entire case and turned suspicion toward someone no one had ever expected: the only survivor, Nils Gustafsson. What had investigators discovered? Had the truth been in front of them the entire time? Or was this one final mistake in a case already riddled with them? For over 4 decades, the Lake Bodom murders remained one of Finland's most baffling mysteries. Then, in 2004, something happened that no one saw coming. After years of dead ends, cold case investigators re-examined the evidence using modern forensic techniques. What they found changed everything. And the result? They arrested Nils Gustafsson, the lone survivor. For over 40 years, Nils had been considered a victim, the only person spared in a merciless massacre. But now detectives were saying he hadn't survived an attack, he had orchestrated it. The news shocked Finland. How could the sole witness, the boy who had been found covered in blood, half dead, actually be the killer? According to the new forensic analysis, bloodstained patterns and injuries didn't add up. Investigators now believed that the attack had originated from inside the tent, not from an external intruder. What did that mean? It meant that someone already inside the tent had started the attack. Someone who had every reason to be there. Someone like Nils Gustafsson. Was this finally the break the case needed? Or were police desperate to close a case that had haunted them for decades? With Gustafsson in custody, prosecutors wasted no time laying out their case. Their theory: this wasn't a random killing. It was an act of rage. According to the prosecution, the events of that night in 1960 had unfolded something like this. The group had been drinking and tensions began to rise. A fight broke out between Nils and Seppo Boisman, possibly over one of the girls. Nils, losing the fight, was humiliated in front of Mela and Anya. In a drunken, rage-fueled breakdown, Nils snapped, grabbing a knife and a blunt object, turning his anger into pure bloodshed. His own injuries, The prosecution argued that they were self-inflicted, an attempt to make himself look like a victim rather than a suspect. The most damning piece of evidence. According to forensic analysts, the bloodstains on Gustafsson's shoes told a disturbing story. His shoes were found over 500 meters away from the crime scene untouched, as if they had never been worn during the attack. Yet, inside the tent, pools of blood from the 3 victims were found, but not Gustafsson's blood. If he had been attacked inside the tent, shouldn't his own blood have been mixed with the others? The prosecution believed this was proof. Nils Gustafsson had murdered his friends, then staged the scene to make himself look like a survivor. But if this was true, why had he stayed at the scene? Why hadn't he tried to flee? And more importantly, could one person have truly overpowered 3 others, all by himself? While the prosecution made a compelling case, Gustafsson's defense team came prepared. They fought back hard, poking holes in the entire narrative presented by the police. Their first major counterargument: the injuries. Nils had a shattered jaw, a fractured skull, and multiple deep wounds. The idea that he had inflicted such devastating injuries on himself was absurd. How could someone with a broken jaw and skull still have the strength to commit 3 murders? And then there was the issue of the weapon. The murder weapon was never found. If Gustafsson had committed the crime, where had he hidden it? No blood was ever discovered on his hands, only on his clothes, which could have been the result of an attack rather than proof of guilt. And what about the missing evidence? His shoes were found far from the crime scene. If he had been the killer, why would he take them off and place them neatly 500 meters away? More importantly, if his shoes were off during the attack, why wasn't his own blood at the scene? The defense also called psychiatric experts to assess Gustafsson's mental state. Their conclusion: there was no history of violent outbursts or aggression. If he had been prone to rage-fueled violence, wouldn't there have been some kind of prior warning? But perhaps the most damaging counterargument came down to this: no physical evidence proved Gustafsson was the killer. In the end, the jury had 2 possibilities before them. Either Nils Gustafsson had spent 4 decades hiding a dark secret, guilty of murdering his closest friends, or he was a victim of one of the greatest miscarriages of justice in Finnish history. The trial was about to reach its dramatic climax. Would Gustafsson be found guilty after all these years? Or was the real killer still out there, free after all this time? The trial of Nils Gustafsson became one of the most controversial in Finnish history. By the time it began, over 40 years had passed since the Lake Bodom murders, yet the case still gripped the nation. People were divided. Some believed Gustafsson was a murderer who had finally been exposed. Others saw him as a victim, a man who had barely survived a horrific crime, only to be wrongly accused decades later. The courtroom was packed. The media swarmed. This wasn't just a case, it was a reckoning. The prosecution presented their forensic evidence. Bloodstain analysis suggested that Gustafsson's shoes had been off during the murders, implying he wasn't a victim but the attacker. The lack of his own blood inside the tent contradicted his claim that he had been attacked along with the others. Witnesses testified about the group drinking that night, suggesting a fight may have broken out. But then came the defense. They brought in medical experts who testified that Gustafsson's injuries were too severe to be self-inflicted. They pointed out the missing murder weapon. If Gustafsson had committed the crime, where was it? They attacked the police's handling of evidence, showing how crucial details had been lost, trampled, or ignored. Then came perhaps the most haunting moment of the trial, when forensic experts reconstructed the attack. Using computer models and injury mapping, They suggested something chilling. The killer had to be someone who could move freely, someone uninjured. But Nils Gustafsson had a broken jaw, fractured skull, and deep wounds. How could he have attacked 3 people, inflicted dozens of stab wounds, dragged himself outside the tent, and staged the scene all with a shattered face? The courtroom fell silent. Had the wrong man been on trial all along? The nation waited, holding its breath. Then, in October 2005, the verdict finally arrived. It had taken 45 years to put Nils Gustafsson on trial, but in just a few minutes, the jury set him free, not guilty. The court ruled that the evidence was inconclusive. There simply wasn't enough proof that Gustafsson had committed the crime. The prosecution had failed to establish a motive, and their forensic findings were not strong enough to convict. And so, after decades of whispers, accusations, and theories, Nils Gustafsson walked out of that courtroom a free man. But was he truly innocent? The case had been too damaged by time, botched from the beginning, clouded by speculation. And though Gustafsson was legally cleared, his name would forever be tied to one of Finland's greatest mysteries. Had justice been served, or had a killer just escaped the law once again? If Nils Gustafsson didn't do it, then who did? The same 3 names that had haunted the case for decades resurfaced. Karl Gyllström, the bitter kiosk owner who had allegedly confessed while drunk but was dismissed due to lack of evidence. Had his suicide in 1969 been a final act of guilt? Hans Assmann, the mysterious German with blood-stained hands who had arrived at a Helsinki hospital the day after the murders, had his high-level connections shielded him from scrutiny? The unidentified blonde man seen walking away from the crime scene at dawn. Who was he? And why was this crucial sighting largely ignored? Some theorists suggested a stranger, an unknown figure who had happened upon the teens and killed them for reasons we may never know. Others believed the crime was personal, that someone close to the victims had a hidden motive, something that had been overlooked in the chaos of the early investigation. The case remains one of Finland's greatest unsolved mysteries. No one knows what really happened that night on the shores of Lake Bodom. But the question lingers. Did the real killer escape justice? Or did the last living witness carry a dark secret to his grave? Decades have passed, yet the Lake Bodom murders remain one of Finland's darkest unsolved crimes. The case has become more than just a crime. It's a legend, a ghost story, a puzzle that refuses to be solved. And with each passing year, the mystery only deepens. True crime enthusiasts pore over the details, searching for clues that might have been missed. Amateur investigators dig into old reports, hoping to find something the police didn't. Internet forums are filled with endless debates, each person convinced they've figured out the truth. But despite all the theories, despite modern forensic advancements, the answer remains just out of reach. And perhaps that's the most unsettling part. Someone got away with murder. And if that person was young enough in 1960, there's a chilling thought to consider. Could they still be alive today, carrying the weight of their secret into old age? Could the real killer be someone's grandfather now, living an ordinary life, watching news reports about the very crime they committed? Or did they take their secret to the grave, leaving behind nothing but a cold case file and a trail of unanswered questions? One thing is certain, the Lake Bodom murders will never truly rest. We've followed the clues, we've examined the evidence, we've walked through every chilling twist in this case. But the ultimate question remains. What really happened that night at Lake Bodom? Was it a targeted killing? Did someone hold a personal grudge against one of the victims, unleashing their rage in the dead of night? Was it a crime of opportunity? Did an unknown drifter stumble upon the sleeping teens and decide to kill without reason? Or was the answer hiding in plain sight all along? Did Karl Gyllström, the angry kiosk owner, finally act on his deep hatred for campers? Did Hans Assmann, the mysterious German with blood-stained hands, have a dark past that police were too afraid to expose? Or was Nils Gustafsson, the sole survivor, truly innocent, or did he know more than he ever admitted? The Lake Bodom murders remain an open case, a puzzle that refuses to be solved. And now it's your turn to decide. What do you believe happened on that fateful night? Drop your theories in the comments below. Let's unravel this mystery together.